He sent his father to a nursing home. Then he found an old cassette tape. There are choices we make in silence, ones that weigh on our shoulders long after we walk away from them. This is a story of such a choiceless son who believed he was doing the right thing, only to discover that buried memories can echo louder than words. Thomas Graham was like many of us, torn between the pressures of modern life and the emotional debts we carry from childhood. When his father, Arthur, began to lose his memory and needed care, Thomas made the decision to move him into a nursing home. It wasn't a decision born out of neglect, but of necessity, or so he thought. Arthur, once a stoic and hardworking man, now wandered hallways forgetting names, dates, even his own reflection. Thomas would visit sometimes once a week, sometimes, not at all always convincing himself that he was doing his best. Life, after all, didn't pause for guilt. But everything changed the day Thomas returned to his father's old house to pack up the remaining belongings. There, tucked in the back of a dusty drawer, he found something unexpected, a cassette tape, labeled simply for Thomas, "When you're ready." What followed wasn't just a recording, it was a doorway. A bridge to a father he thought he'd lost long before the nursing home. A message that didn't just reveal memories, but forced Thomas to confront a truth he had buried. That love, when unspoken, doesn't disappear. It waits. This story isn't just about a man and his father. It's about all of us who have said too little, too late. About the weight of decisions made in the name of practicality and the redemption that sometimes lies in the smallest, most unexpected places. Let me take you back before the tape. Before the silence. To where it all began. Thomas sat in his car, engine running, hands gripping the wheel tightly. Through the windshield, could see the brick building that had become his father's new home, a nursing facility named Willow Pines. A place with wide hallways, smiling staff, and large windows that somehow felt more like glass barriers than invitations to the outside world. He had made the decision 2 months ago. His father, Arthur, had been forgetting things' first names, then entire days. One evening, Arthur had gone for a walk and forgotten his own address. A neighbor found him on a bench across town, confused, asking for a wife who'd passed away years ago. That night, Thomas had finally admitted to himself what he'd been denying for months. His father couldn't live alone anymore. It wasn't supposed to feel like abandonment. It was supposed to be the responsible thing, the loving thing even. The staff were professionals, his father would be safe, cared for, he would have company. That's what Thomas told himself over and over. But the guilt never left him. It sat beside him in the car, rode home with him, slept next to him. His visits had started out frequent 3 times a week, then once a week, and now it had been 12 days since he last came. Each time he approached the facility, he felt the weight grow heavier. Arthur never got angry. He never asked why Thomas didn't visit more. But something in his eyes, an absent look, a delayed Thomas that the distance wasn't just physical. On this particular visit, Thomas brought along some of his father's favorite books. Arthur used to love reading Hemingway, even reciting entire passages from memory. Now, the man struggled to finish a sentence. "Dad," Thomas said softly as he entered the room. Arthur turned his head slowly. His eyes lit up with recognition. Or maybe just politeness? "Tommy," he said after a pause, voice dry and thin. They sat together in silence for several minutes. Thomas opened one of the books and began to read. Arthur listened quietly, occasionally nodding. His gaze fixed out the window where birds landed on a tree branch and took off again. "Do you remember this one?" Thomas asked. Arthur blinked. "It's familiar." Later, as Thomas helped organize his father's drawers, he found small slips of paper with names written on them. Names of long-dead relatives, old addresses, phrases like check stove or feed dog, though they no longer had a pet. Each note was a reminder that Arthur was trying desperately to hold on to the pieces. That night, Thomas drove to his father's house, his childhood home, to start sorting through what was left. The place hadn't been touched in weeks. Settled on the bookshelves, Family portraits hung crooked on the wall. The air smelled faintly of old wood and time. He wandered through the living room, then into his father's study. It was exactly how Arthur had left it, neatly stacked bills on the desk, a faded globe in the corner, and dozens of cassette tapes lined up in a dusty wooden box. Thomas reached for one of the tapes. Most were labeled with simple dates: August 1983. Christmas 94. He assumed they were recordings of music, or perhaps old conversations. But one stood out. A tape labeled in shaky handwriting for Thomas, "When You're Ready." He paused. The label was unsettling in its simplicity. Not happy birthday, not family memories. Just those 5 words, as if Arthur had always known there would come a time when Thomas would need something, anything. To help him understand, he stared at it for a long moment before slipping it into his pocket. Asterisk. Thomas didn't listen to the tape that night, kept it in his coat pocket where it stayed for 3 more days. Each time he reached for his phone or keys, his fingers brushed against the cassette. It was a physical weight, small but impossible. To ignore Dot, he didn't own a cassette player. Who did anymore? On the 4th evening, he finally dug through the boxes in his attic, looking for the old tape recorder he used in college journalism class. Dusty, slightly cracked at the edges, but still intact. He found a couple of AA batteries and clicked the tape inside. He hesitated, thumb hovering over the play button. When he pressed it, the familiar scratchy hiss of old magnetic tape filled the room, followed by the unmistakable voice of his father. "Thomas," the voice said, "if you're hearing this, I suppose I'm not quite the man you remember anymore. Maybe I've forgotten your name. Maybe I've forgotten my own. But I want you to know I remember this." There was a pause, and Thomas felt the air still. In his lungs. "I remember the first time I held you," the tape continued. "You were 5 pounds and some change, crying like the world was ending. I remember thinking, God, I have no idea what I'm doing. But when you wrapped your hand around my finger, I thought maybe I didn't have to know everything. Maybe love would be enough." Thomas sat in silence, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. The recording went on. "I know I haven't always said things right. I know I wasn't easy. Your mother was better with words. She knew how to talk to you, how to soften things. I came from a place where silence meant strength, where men didn't say much. But I want you to know, Thomas, I was always proud of you, even when I didn't say it." Thomas felt his throat tighten. He hadn't expected it to be like this, not so personal, not so painfully direct. It was like Arthur had been sitting in the room, looking straight at him. "I've made mistakes," the voice continued. "Maybe too many to count. I stayed late at work when I should have been home. I missed birthdays. I forgot how to laugh after your mother died. I turned into someone you didn't recognize. But I never stopped loving you. Never once." Thomas wiped a hand over his face. Then came another pause, longer this time. Almost like Arthur had stood up and walked away, only to return with something else on his mind. "There's something I never told you," the voice said finally. "Something I think you deserve to know. You remember that old record store I used to take you to? Downtown? Told you it was just for the music, but it wasn't. That was the place I used to go when things got heavy, when I didn't know how to be a father or a man or anything in between. I'd sit in that back booth with a coffee and I'd listen. Not to the records, but to the people. How they loved. How they failed. And I wrote about it in notebooks I never showed you." Thomas frowned. "Notebooks. If you're still listening, go to the study. Find the bookshelf, left side, second shelf from the bottom. There's a panel. Push it." Thomas stood up suddenly, heart racing. The tape was still playing, but he was already pulling on his jacket. Back at the house, it was nearly midnight when he entered the study. The old desk lamp barely lit the room. He went to the shelf, kneeling where his father described. He ran his hand along the back of the books, and there it was, a small wooden panel. Loose at the edge. He pushed. The panel fell back with a soft click, revealing a narrow compartment. Inside were 6 leather-bound notebooks, He pulled them out one by one. Opening the first, the pages were filled with his father's neat, slanted handwriting. But these weren't to-do lists or bills. These were letters, thoughts, reflections, pages and pages of Arthur's unspoken life. To Thomas, age 6 today, you made a spaceship out of cereal boxes. You told me I was your co-pilot, but I didn't have the heart to tell you that I didn't. Feel worthy. To Thomas, age 15, I saw the way you looked when I forgot your concert. You said it was fine. But it wasn't, and I knew I was losing something I couldn't name. To Thomas, age 25, you moved out today. I pretended I was glad, but I stood in your empty room for hours. I wanted to call, but I was afraid you wouldn't answer. Each page was a world of emotion that Arthur had never shared out loud, and now, in the quiet of that old study, Thomas finally heard his father's voice, not the one weakened by age, but the one powered by love and regret, hope and memory. He sat down on the floor, surrounded by notebooks and tears, for the first time in years. Thomas didn't feel abandoned. He felt seen. Thomas didn't sleep that night. He stayed on the study floor, leafing through each notebook as if they were lifelines thrown from a drowning man he never truly understood. His father's words were raw, honest, and deeply human. They didn't try to excuse the pain, they just acknowledged it. Each letter was like a missing piece in a puzzle Thomas hadn't realized was incomplete by morning. He'd read through nearly half of the notebooks. His back ached and his eyes burned, but his heart felt alive, like it was beating in a new rhythm, one that echoed Arthur's regrets, but also his quiet love. Later that afternoon, Thomas returned to the nursing home. He hadn't told anyone he was coming. When he stepped through the door, the nurse at the front desk looked up, surprised. "Mr. Hayes," she said kindly. "Your father's in the garden today. That's unusual for him." Thomas nodded and followed the small path around the building. There, he was Arthur sitting in a wheelchair beneath the shade of an old oak tree. A blue blanket draped over his lap, his gaze fixed on something far away. The same faraway look he always had in his later years, as if searching for something long gone. Thomas approached slowly. "Unsure of what to say, Dad," he finally said. Voice low. Arthur didn't look up. Thomas crouched beside him. "It's me." Arthur blinked. For a moment, there was nothing. Then his eyes focused just slightly. "Tommy," he said uncertainly. Thomas nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Yeah, I came to see you." Arthur's hand twitched, as if trying to lift. Thomas reached out and held it, feeling how fragile it had become, thin skin over bone and memory. "I found the tape," Thomas whispered, "and the notebooks. I heard everything you never said." Arthur's lips trembled. His eyes, though clouded, welled up. A tear slipped down the side of his cheek. "I was scared," he said after a long silence. "Of saying the wrong thing, of not being enough." Thomas let out a shaky breath. "You were enough. Maybe not perfect, but enough." He sat there beside his father for a long time, holding his hand. No grand reconciliation, no dramatic apology. Just presence. Just a son who had finally learned to see the man behind the silence. When the sun began to set, Thomas stood up and wheeled Arthur inside. In the days that followed, Thomas visited often. He brought photos, stories, and even music tapes, and digital files of songs they used to listen to in the car. Sometimes Arthur responded. Sometimes he didn't. But Thomas kept coming. He started reading the notebooks out loud to him. To Thomas, age 10, he'd say, holding back tears, "When you asked me if Mom was watching us from the sky, I said yes. I wish I'd told you more about her, about the way she laughed in the kitchen, or sang off-key while folding laundry. I wish I'd known how to keep her alive for you." Arthur would close his eyes, and sometimes for a second, he would smile. One morning, after a reading session, the nurse pulled Thomas aside. "He seems calmer when you're here," she said. "More aware. You're doing something right." Thomas, looked over at his father, who was napping peacefully in his chair. "I'm just trying to listen now," he said quietly. "That's something I didn't do for a long time." Later that week, Thomas brought a small tape recorder of his own. He started recording messages, not just for his dad, but for his future self. And maybe even his own kids one day. "Today, I realized how much of life we let slip by because we're afraid." He spoke softly into the mic. "Afraid of saying what matters. Afraid of being misunderstood. My dad didn't have the words when I was young. And I didn't have the patience when he got old. But here we are, finding each other one word at a time." It became a ritual. He'd talk into the recorder in the evenings, share stories from the day, or read passages from Arthur's notebooks. The past and the present weaving together, like thread through a frayed shirt, messy but somehow holding. One day, while helping clean out a closet in Arthur's room, Thomas found a box labeled Thomas Drawings. Inside were dozens of childlike crayon sketches of spaceships, animals, his parents holding hands. Each had been carefully dated and stored. Some with little notes on the back in Arthur's handwriting. "Your imagination is a gift. Read one. Never lose your curiosity. Read another." Thomas stared at them for a long time. His father hadn't been absent. He'd just shown love in ways Thomas hadn't recognized. He took the box home that night, set it next to the notebooks, and felt something lift. Maybe the story wasn't perfect, but it wasn't over either. Asterisk. The next few weeks became a quiet rhythm in Thomas's life. He would visit the nursing home every other day, sometimes staying for hours, sometimes just a short while. Arthur had good days and bad. On the good days, he'd nod, smile faintly, or respond to Thomas's stories with a whispered word. On the bad ones, he'd stare out the window, distant and unreachable. But Thomas came anyway. One evening, as autumn began to creep into the air, Thomas sat beside his father and pulled out one of the later notebooks. The cover was worn, almost falling apart. On the first page, Arthur had written, "For the days I might forget but still want to remember." Thomas turned the pages gently, reading aloud. Some entries were mundane, what Arthur had eaten, how the weather felt, but others were small bursts of memory. Fragments of fatherhood that had been buried under years of silence. "You were 5. When you asked me why the moon follows us in the car, I told you it was magic, but I wish I'd told you the science too. You made me a Father's Day card with glitter and macaroni. I kept it in my drawer for 10 years. I didn't know how to comfort you when your dog died. I bought you a new one a week later. That was a mistake, I see that now." Each sentence was a confession, a breadcrumb from a man who had never known how to speak his heart aloud. When Thomas looked up, he found Arthur watching him, not entirely lucid, but not gone either. There was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Peace. Do you remember any of that?" Thomas asked gently. Arthur didn't reply, but his fingers tapped faintly against the armrest in rhythm with the soft music playing in the background. A Sinatra tune, one of his favorites. Thomas smiled. "You used to hum that when you washed dishes?" A faint smile twitched at the edge of Arthur's lips. That night, Thomas sat in his car longer than usual before starting the engine. The street lights cast long shadows across the dashboard. He thought about all the years he had spent feeling abandoned, resentful, hollow, and how none of those feelings had disappeared. But they had changed shape. They weren't weights anymore. They were threads connecting him to a father he'd finally begun to understand, at home. Thomas opened a blank notebook and began to write. Not for anyone else, just for himself. But maybe someday. For someone who would want to understand him the way he had finally come to understand his dad. He wrote about regret, not in dramatic strokes, but in the small things. "I wish I'd asked more questions. I wish I'd paid attention when he still had the words. I wish I hadn't waited until it was almost too late." But he also wrote about forgiveness, I forgive him for not knowing how. I forgive myself for not trying harder. A week later, Arthur's health declined rapidly. The nurses told Thomas it wouldn't be long. He came every day now, reading, talking, just sitting. One afternoon, as the sun filtered through the blinds and bathed the room in gold, Arthur opened. His eyes really opened them. He looked directly at Thomas and said, "Thank you for listening." It was the clearest his voice had sounded in weeks. Thomas took his hand. "Thank you for finally speaking." Arthur gave one last, small nod, then closed his eyes again. He passed 2 days later, no drama, no final scene. Just a quiet, breathless departure in the early morning hours. Thomas was there, holding his hand. He didn't cry immediately. He just sat still, heart heavy, but whole in a way he hadn't known possible at the funeral. Thomas placed the old tape recorder next to Arthur's urn. Inside it was the original cassette, the message that had changed everything. Later, he took it back home, not because he couldn't let go, but because he knew that story still had something to say. And maybe one day someone else would need to hear it too. Life after Arthur's passing was quieter, but not in a lonely way. It was a silence that held presence, a room that echoed with memory rather than absence. Thomas resumed his daily routines, but something inside him had irrevocably shifted. The bitterness that had clung to him for decades had softened. In its place grew something else: compassion, clarity, maybe even peace. He kept the notebooks and the cassette tape in a small wooden box on his bookshelf. Every once in a while, he would take them out, run his fingers over the covers, and reread parts that still tugged at his heart. But he didn't do it out of grief. He did it to remember who they both had been and how far they had come. What surprised him most was how much he wanted to share the story. Not just the part about finding the tape, or the quiet conversations in the nursing home, but the whole messy, beautiful arc, the resentment, the silence, the regret, and the redemption. One day he started a blog. It's just a small, anonymous space online where he could write. His first post was titled, "The Day I Found My Father's Voice." He didn't expect anyone to read it, but they did. Comments began to pour in from strangers who had never spoken to their fathers, from children who had been abandoned, from parents who didn't know how to love out loud, from people who were grieving, healing, or simply searching for a way to forgive. One message stood out. "I played the old messages my mom left on our answering machine. For years, they hurt too much. But today I listened again. And this time, I heard her love instead of her absence. Thank you." Thomas realized then this wasn't just his story, it was all of ours. A few months later, Thomas gave a talk at a local community center about reconciliation and late forgiveness. He brought the cassette tape with him and played a portion of Arthur's message. He watched as people closed their eyes, some wiping away tears, others simply sitting in stillness. Afterward, a young woman approached him. "I haven't talked to my dad in 10 years, she said. "But I think I'm going to call him tonight." Thomas smiled. "Do it. Even if you don't know what to say, just start." That night, Thomas sat alone on his porch. The stars were out and the air was cool with early spring. He remembered something Arthur had written in the very last page of one of the notebooks. "If I leave anything behind, hope it's this, that love even the quiet, broken kind can still echo if someone is willing to listen." Okay? And Thomas had listened. Not just to the tape, not just to the pages, but to the silence in between. The things his father couldn't say, the fear, shame, the buried hope. He had listened and, in doing so, had found something worth keeping. He stood up, went inside, and picked up his pen. There was more story to write, not just about his father, but about how healing begins, not with answers, but with questions. Not with perfection, but with presence. And not always in time, but sometimes, just barely soon enough. Asterisk, if this story moved you, it reminded you of someone you haven't spoken to in a while. or stirred a memory you thought you'd buried, then maybe now is the time to reach out. You don't have to wait for the perfect words. You don't need a dramatic reunion or a big emotional moment. Sometimes all it takes is a simple message. Hey, I was thinking about you. Because the truth is, time slips away faster than we realize. And often, the pain of silence weighs heavier than the risk of speaking. Maybe you've been carrying anger or hurt or regret. Maybe you've convinced yourself that the distance is permanent. But what if it isn't? What if your voice, just a few honest words, could change everything? This isn't just Thomas's story. It's a story shared by millions of people who wish they had one more chance to listen, to forgive, or to say what was left unsaid. Don't wait for a tape, a letter, or a box of memories to remind you of what matters. Pick up the phone, write the message, have the conversation, and if you've already lost that chance. If your person is no longer here, then maybe take a moment today to sit with their memory. Write them a letter, speak to them out loud. Listen for the echoes, because healing doesn't always come from them. Sometimes it comes from you. If this story meant something to you, please share it. You never know who might need to hear it. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to follow more real stories about pain, hope, and the quiet courage it takes to love. You are not alone. Asterisk.